Welcome to No Sleep, Historian, where the past never rests quietly, and what we remember is only what we're allowed to. Tonight, we step into the space between truth and time itself, and question whether some of history's darkest centuries ever existed at all. What if I told you that the year you were born might be a lie, that we're not actually living in 2025, but centuries earlier? According to one controversial theory, more than 300 years of human history were fabricated, not misunderstood, not lost, invented. Dates changed, documents forged, and entire wars and emperors conjured out of thin air. It sounds impossible until you start looking at the cracks in the timeline. This is the phantom time hypothesis, and it begins with one very inconvenient question. What if the Middle Ages never happened? Part 1. The Heretic Chronologist. In 1991, a German systems analyst turned historian named Heribert Illig published a paper that would shake the foundations of medieval scholarship. Unlike traditional historians who spend decades poring over ancient manuscripts in university libraries, Illig approached history with the analytical mind of a systems engineer. He looked at the timeline of human civilization not as a sacred narrative, but as data to be verified and cross-referenced. What he found disturbed him deeply. Illig's central claim was audacious beyond measure. The years 614 to 911 AD never existed. According to his research, these 297 years were wholesale fabrications inserted into our historical timeline by medieval power brokers who needed to legitimize their authority by connecting themselves to specific prophetic dates. In Illig's version of history, the year 614 AD was immediately followed by 911 AD, meaning Charlemagne's empire, the rise of Islam's early expansion into Europe, and the foundation of many medieval institutions simply never happened as we've been taught. The German researcher didn't arrive at this conclusion lightly. Illig spent years analyzing archaeological evidence, astronomical records, and architectural developments, searching for the kind of continuous cultural evolution that should mark any 3-century period. Instead, he found what he described as a black hole in human development. The transition from late Roman civilization to what we call the High Middle Ages seemed to skip over an entire epoch of gradual change, jumping instead from one distinct phase to another with no apparent bridging period. Illig argued that this fabrication wasn't the work of a single individual or even a single generation. Instead, he proposed that a coordinated effort by medieval rulers and church authorities systematically created false documentations, backdated architectural projects, and invented entire lineages of kings and queens to fill in the historical gaps they needed to justify their contemporary political arrangements. The scope of such a deception would require unprecedented cooperation across multiple kingdoms, languages, and cultures. Yet Illig insisted the evidence demanded no less radical an explanation. The implications of Illig's hypothesis extend far beyond mere historical curiosity. If accurate, it would mean that our entire understanding of medieval development, religious evolution, and cultural progress has been built on a foundation of systematic lies. Carbon dating, architectural analysis, and linguistic evolution would all need to be re-examined through the lens of potential manipulation. More unsettling still, it raises the question of what other periods in human history might have been similarly fabricated, and whether our modern timeline itself can be trusted. Critics immediately dismissed Illig as a fringe theorist, pointing to overwhelming archaeological and documentary evidence supporting the traditional chronology. Yet, Illig's background in systems analysis gave him tools that traditional historians often lack: the ability to spot inconsistencies in large datasets and the willingness to question fundamental assumptions that others take for granted. His work opened a door to a darker possibility that history itself might be humanity's greatest conspiracy, and that the guardians of knowledge have been lying to us for over 1,000 years about the very nature of time itself. Part 2. The Emperor Midiror, who time traveled. At the heart of Illig's theory lies one of history's most ambitious alleged conspiracies, centered around two of medieval Europe's most powerful figures: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. According to the phantom time hypothesis, these two men orchestrated perhaps the greatest chronological fraud in human history, manipulating the calendar itself to align Otto's reign with the prophetically significant year 1000 AD. Otto III ascended to the Holy Roman Empire in 996 AD. But according to Illig, the young emperor wasn't content with ruling during what seemed like an arbitrary point in history. Medieval Christian theology placed enormous significance on millennial dates, viewing the year 1000 as a potential time of spiritual renewal, apocalyptic fulfillment, or divine transformation. Otto, deeply influenced by Christian mysticism and imperial Roman aspirations, allegedly wanted his reign to coincide with this momentous year, believing it would legitimize his authority as both a temporal and spiritual leader. Pope Sylvester II, born Gerbert of Aurlach, was uniquely positioned to facilitate such an ambitious deception. Known as one of the most brilliant minds of his era, Sylvester was a mathematician, astronomer, and scholar who had studied Islamic science in Spain and possessed knowledge of advanced calculation techniques unknown to most European intellectuals. If anyone in medieval Europe possessed the technical expertise to manipulate calendar systems, it was Sylvester. His contemporaries already viewed him with suspicion, with some chroniclers suggesting he had made pacts with demonic forces to acquire his extraordinary knowledge. The mechanism for this chronological manipulation involved the Anno Domini dating system, which had been introduced by the monk Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century, but wasn't widely adopted until centuries later. According to Illig, Otto and Sylvester took advantage of this transitional period to insert approximately 300 years of fictional history, complete with fabricated documents, false genealogies, and invented events that would bridge the gap between the genuine 7th century and their own time. This conspiracy required extraordinary coordination across multiple kingdoms and institutions. Monasteries throughout Europe would need to participate in creating false chronicles. Royal courts would need to forge genealogical documents connecting contemporary rulers to ancient dynasties, and scholars would need to retroactively invent literary and philosophical works to populate the fictional centuries. Yet both Otto and Sylvester possessed the political authority and intellectual networks necessary to coordinate such an undertaking. The political benefits of such a deception were enormous. By placing his reign at the dawn of the new millennium, Otto could present himself as an emperor chosen by divine providence to rule during Christianity's most significant historical transition. The papal authority would similarly benefit, as the Church could claim spiritual leadership during humanity's millennial transformation. Together, they could legitimize sweeping political and religious reforms by claiming they were fulfilling ancient prophecies and continuing unbroken chains of authority stretching back to Constantine and Charlemagne. Archaeological evidence, according to Illig, supports this theory of chronological manipulation. The transition from Carolingian to Ottonian architectural styles shows none of the gradual evolution that should characterize 3 centuries of development. Instead, building techniques, artistic motifs, and construction materials seem to jump abruptly from one distinct phase to another, as if the supposed intervening centuries had been compressed or eliminated entirely. Similarly, coinage from the alleged Phantom period shows inconsistencies in metal composition, artistic style, and production techniques that suggest systematic backdating rather than authentic contemporary minting. The success of this conspiracy, if true, represents one of the most audacious manipulations of human knowledge ever attempted. Otto and Sylvester wouldn't merely have changed political boundaries or religious doctrines. They would have altered humanity's fundamental understanding of time itself, creating centuries of false history that subsequent generations would accept as unquestionable fact. The ramifications extend far beyond medieval studies, raising profound questions about the reliability of historical knowledge and the potential for systematic deception on scales previously thought impossible. Part 3. Charlemagne the Man Who Wasn't There. Perhaps no aspect of Illig's phantom time hypothesis is more provocative than his claim that Charlemagne, the towering figure of medieval European history, never existed at all. According to Illig, the man we know as Charles the Great, founder of the Carolingian Empire and father of medieval Europe, was a fictional composite character created to populate the invented centuries between 614 and 911 AD. The traditional narrative of Charlemagne presents him as one of history's most consequential rulers. Born around 747 AD, he supposedly united most of Western Europe under his rule, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III in 800 AD, promoted education and learning throughout his domains, and established the political foundations that would dominate European politics for centuries. His reign represents the bridge between the chaos of the post-Roman world and the organized feudal systems of the High Middle Ages. Yet, Illig argues that this narrative contains too many anachronisms and inconsistencies to be historically genuine. The speed and scope of Charlemagne's alleged conquests, covering vast territories from northern Spain to eastern Germany, would have required logistical capabilities that didn't exist in the supposed 8th century. The administrative systems attributed to his empire demonstrate sophisticated bureaucratic techniques that show no evolutionary development from earlier periods, appearing instead to emerge fully formed without precedent. More troubling still are the documentary sources for Charlemagne's existence. The primary contemporary account of his life, Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, wasn't written until decades after Charlemagne's supposed death, and shows suspicious similarities to classical Roman biographies, particularly Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars. Illig suggests that Einhard's biography was a deliberate attempt to create a historical figure who could serve as an idealized medieval emperor, combining the military prowess of Roman generals with the Christian piety expected of medieval kings. The archaeological evidence surrounding Charlemagne is equally problematic. Aachen Cathedral, supposedly built as Charlemagne's imperial chapel, demonstrates architectural techniques and artistic styles that appear centuries ahead of their supposed construction date. The building's complex geometry, sophisticated vault systems, and integrated decorative programs show no evolutionary relationship to earlier Frankish construction. Instead, they seem to represent a sudden leap in architectural sophistication that makes more sense if dated to the 11th or 12th centuries rather than the early 9th. Illig proposes that the figure we know as Charlemagne was actually a compilation of several historical rulers whose reigns were compressed and mythologized to create a single legendary emperor. Elements of his biography may derive from Charles Martel, the 8th century Frankish leader who defeated Muslim armies at the Battle of Tours, combined with attributes of later Ottonian emperors and literary embellishments drawn from classical sources. The coinage attributed to Charlemagne's reign shows similar anomalies. Carolingian deniers display minting techniques and silver purity levels that are inconsistent with the supposed technological capabilities of 8th century Europe. The standardized weight and design of these coins suggest a level of administrative control and technical sophistication that would be more appropriate for later medieval periods. Additionally, the geographical distribution of Carolingian coins shows patterns that don't align with the political boundaries described in contemporary chronicles. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural achievements attributed to Charlemagne's court, particularly the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, appear to emerge without any developmental foundation. The sudden flourishing of scholarship, manuscript production, and educational reform that supposedly characterized his reign shows no gradual buildup from earlier periods. Libraries appear fully stocked with classical texts that had supposedly been lost for centuries. Scholars emerge with sophisticated knowledge of Latin grammar and rhetoric without apparent teachers, and educational institutions spring up across Europe with standardized curricula that suggest central coordination on an unprecedented scale. The implications of Charlemagne's non-existence extend far beyond medieval history. If one of Europe's most foundational political figures was fictional, it calls into question the reliability of medieval documentary sources and the methods historians use to verify ancient claims. It suggests that entire political narratives might be retrospective constructions designed to legitimize later medieval power structures. Most unsettling of all, it implies that the foundations of European civilization, as we understand them, might be built on sophisticated lies that have been accepted as truth for over 1,000 years. Part 4. The Black Hole in the Calendar. The mathematics of time itself provides some of the most compelling evidence for the phantom time hypothesis, particularly in the discrepancies between different calendar systems and the astronomical observations they were supposed to track. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the Julian calendar in 1582, creating the Gregorian calendar we use today, he removed 10 days from the year to correct for accumulated errors in astronomical calculations. But according to Illig, the mathematics of this correction reveals a much larger chronological problem than historians have been willing to acknowledge. The Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, was designed to keep the calendar year synchronized with the actual solar year by adding an extra day every 4 years. However, the Julian year was slightly longer than the actual solar year by approximately 11 minutes and 14 seconds annually. Over centuries, this small error accumulated, causing the calendar to drift relative to the seasons and astronomical events like the spring equinox. When Gregory reformed the calendar, his astronomers calculated that the Julian calendar had accumulated approximately 10 days of error since the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This calculation was based on the assumption that roughly 1,257 years had passed between 325 and 1582. that mathematical correction seemed straightforward. Remove 10 days and adjust the leap year rules to prevent future drift. But Illig argues that the mathematics tells a different story. If we calculate the accumulated error based on the actual length of the Julian year compared to the solar year, the 10-day correction suggests that only about 700 years had passed between 325 and 1582, not the supposed 1,257 years. The missing time amounts to approximately 297 years. Precisely the period Illig identifies as phantom time between 614 and 911 AD. This astronomical argument becomes more compelling when examined alongside other calendar anomalies. Ancient astronomical records from various civilizations show celestial events like eclipses, comet appearances, and planetary alignments that don't align properly with the conventional chronology when we attempt to work backward from known modern astronomical data. Chinese astronomical records, which maintained continuous observations for thousands of years, show patterns of celestial events that suggest different dating for European historical events than our current chronology indicates. The problem extends beyond simple calendar drift. Medieval chroniclers frequently recorded astronomical phenomena like eclipses and comets as omens accompanying significant historical events. When modern astronomers calculate the actual dates of these astronomical occurrences and compare them to the supposed dates of the historical events they allegedly accompanied, the correlations often fail to match. Either the chroniclers were systematically wrong about what they observed, or the dating of the events they described has been artificially altered. Islamic and Byzantine astronomical records present additional complications for conventional chronology. Both civilizations maintained sophisticated astronomical observations throughout the period that European sources describe as the Dark Ages. Yet their records of celestial events during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries show patterns that suggest a compressed timeline rather than 3 full centuries of observations. Star charts, eclipse records, and descriptions of planetary positions show too much consistency and too little accumulated change for the supposed duration of the period. The development of astronomical instruments and techniques during the alleged phantom period also raises questions. The sophisticated astrolabes quadrants and other instruments that appear in European sources during the late 9th and early 10th centuries demonstrate mathematical and engineering capabilities that show no evolutionary development from earlier periods. Instead, they seem to appear fully developed, suggesting either that the technological progression has been compressed or that the instruments were backdated to support false chronologies. Carbon dating, often cited as definitive proof against the phantom time hypothesis, relies on assumptions about atmospheric carbon-14 levels that may themselves be problematic if the chronology has been manipulated. The calibration curves used to convert radiocarbon dates to calendar dates are based on tree ring sequences and other natural records that assume the conventional chronology is correct. If that assumption is false, then carbon dating might actually support, rather than contradict, the phantom time theory. Perhaps most troubling of all, the mathematical precision required to insert 297 phantom years while maintaining astronomical consistency across multiple calendar systems and civilizations suggests a level of coordination and technical sophistication that medieval conspirators supposedly couldn't have possessed. Yet the evidence suggests that someone, somehow, managed to manipulate not just historical records, but the very framework we use to measure the passage of time itself. Part 5. The architecture that shouldn't exist. The built environment of medieval Europe presents one of the most puzzling aspects of the Phantom. Time hypothesis. Architectural achievements that appear centuries ahead of their supposed construction dates. Buildings attributed to the 8th, 9th, and early 10th centuries demonstrate sophisticated engineering, advanced mathematical knowledge, and construction techniques that show no evolutionary development from earlier periods, yet supposedly predated later innovations by generations. Aachen Cathedral stands as perhaps the most problematic example. Traditionally dated to around 800 AD and attributed to Charlemagne's patronage. The building demonstrates architectural sophistication that seems impossible for its supposed time period. The octagonal central space, crowned by a complex dome, required mathematical calculations and engineering techniques that weren't supposed to exist in Carolingian Europe. The precise geometric relationships, the sophisticated vault construction, and the integration of classical Roman spolia with contemporary stonework suggest knowledge of architectural principles that wouldn't be seen again in European construction until the 12th century. The bronze doors and metalwork of Aachen present additional chronological problems. The casting techniques, alloy compositions, and artistic motifs demonstrate metallurgical capabilities that far exceed what archaeological evidence suggests was available in 8th century Europe. The doors show influence from Byzantine artistic traditions that supposedly hadn't yet reached the Frankish kingdoms, and they incorporate design elements that wouldn't become common in European art for another 2 centuries. Similar anomalies appear throughout the Carolingian architectural record. The monastery of Saint Riquier, supposedly built in the late 8th century, featured multiple towers, complex liturgical arrangements, and construction techniques that show no precedent in earlier Frankish building, yet anticipate developments that wouldn't occur elsewhere for generations. The level of architectural planning required for such a complex would have demanded sophisticated knowledge of structural engineering, acoustics, and liturgical requirements that the supposedly primitive Carolingian church couldn't have possessed. The problem extends beyond individual buildings to entire urban planning schemes. Cities attributed to Carolingian foundation or expansion show street layouts, defensive systems, and infrastructure arrangements that demonstrate understanding of civic planning principles derived from Roman engineering knowledge. Yet, the supposed timeline suggests this knowledge had been lost for centuries and wouldn't be recovered until the urban revival of the 11th and 12th centuries. Stone carving and decorative sculpture from the Phantom period present their own chronological challenges. The quality and sophistication of carved capitals, figural reliefs, and architectural ornament attributed to 8th and 9th century workshops exceed the capabilities suggested by earlier examples and show technical mastery that supposedly wouldn't develop until the Romanesque revival. The artistic motifs, iconographic programs, and stylistic coherence suggest organized workshops with access to pattern books and artistic traditions that the conventional chronology claims were unavailable during the supposed Dark Ages. Construction materials and techniques provide additional evidence of chronological compression. Buildings supposedly constructed during the Phantom period show evidence of quarrying operations, stone transportation systems, and mortar compositions that require infrastructure and technical knowledge inconsistent with the economic and political chaos that supposedly characterized post-Carolingian Europe. The scale of some projects would have demanded labor organizations, financial systems, and logistical coordination that the conventional narrative suggests didn't exist until centuries later. The geographic distribution of advanced architectural features during the alleged Phantom period also raises questions. Sophisticated building techniques appear simultaneously across wide geographical areas without evidence of the gradual diffusion that should characterize technological innovation. Instead, complex vault systems, advanced masonry techniques, and sophisticated decorative programs seem to emerge fully developed across multiple regions, suggesting either unprecedented communication networks or chronological compression that eliminated the time needed for gradual technological spread. Perhaps most significantly, the architectural record shows what Illig describes as evolutionary gaps, where building techniques seem to jump from one level of sophistication to another without intermediate stages. The transition from simple post-Romanesque construction to the complex achievements attributed to Carolingian architects shows none of the experimental phases, failed attempts, and gradual refinements that characterize genuine technological development. Instead, the architectural record suggests that sophisticated techniques appeared suddenly, were maintained for the duration of the Phantom period, and then continued evolving during the conventionally recognized High Middle Ages. The implications extend beyond architectural history to broader questions about medieval technological capabilities and cultural transmission. If buildings attributed to the 8th and 9th centuries actually date to the 11th and 12th centuries, it would resolve many of the anomalies that have puzzled architectural historians. It would also suggest that the entire narrative of medieval architectural development has been distorted by chronological manipulation, with 3 centuries of genuine innovation compressed into a much shorter period and then backdated to support false historical narratives. Part 6. The Silent Centuries. The period between 600 and 900 AD presents historians with what might be called the Silent Centuries, a time when European civilization appears to enter a state of suspended animation, with cultural development, technological innovation, and social complexity remaining essentially static for 300 years before suddenly resuming rapid advancement. This unprecedented pause in human progress forms one of the strongest arguments for the phantom time hypothesis. Archaeological evidence from across Europe shows a curious pattern during these supposed centuries. Settlement patterns remain virtually unchanged. Pottery styles show minimal evolution, and agricultural techniques demonstrate no significant innovation. This static quality contrasts sharply with the dynamic changes visible in the archaeological record, both before and after this period. The late Roman transition period shows clear evidence of cultural transformation, technological adaptation, and social reorganization. Similarly, the High Medieval period demonstrates rapid innovation in agriculture, technology, urban development, and intellectual achievement. Agricultural development during the Silent Centuries presents particularly striking anomalies. The 3-field system, heavy plows, horse collars, and other innovations that would revolutionize medieval farming appear to emerge suddenly around 1000 AD without evidence of gradual development during the preceding centuries. Archaeological investigations of medieval farm sites show continuous use of primitive farming techniques throughout the supposed Phantom period, followed by rapid adoption of advanced methods that dramatically increased agricultural productivity and population capacity. Urban archaeology reveals similar patterns of stagnation followed by sudden development. Cities throughout Europe show minimal growth, construction, or infrastructure development between 600 and 900 AD, despite evidence of active settlement throughout the period. Then, around 1000 AD, these same settlements begin showing rapid expansion, sophisticated planning, and construction projects that suggest sudden access to resources, technical knowledge, and organizational capabilities that supposedly hadn't existed for centuries. Manuscript production and literary culture present perhaps the most telling evidence of chronological manipulation. The number of surviving texts from the Phantom period is drastically smaller than from either earlier or later periods, despite the supposed establishment of scriptoriums and educational institutions throughout Carolingian Europe. More suspicious still, many of the texts that supposedly originate from this period show linguistic, paleographic, and stylistic features that suggest later composition. The famous Carolingian minuscule script, attributed to educational reforms of the 8th century, appears fully developed without evolutionary antecedents and demonstrates standardization across wide geographical areas that would have required unprecedented coordination. Legal and administrative documents from the silent centuries show similar anomalies. Court records, land grants, and administrative texts demonstrate sophisticated legal concepts and bureaucratic procedures that appear without developmental foundations in earlier periods. The famous capitularies attributed to Charlemagne and his successors show legal sophistication and administrative complexity that suggests governmental capabilities far exceeding what the supposed economic and social conditions of the time could have supported. Coinage and monetary systems provide additional evidence of cultural stagnation. The debasement of silver content in Carolingian deniers, the reduction in coin production, and the apparent breakdown of monetary exchange systems all suggest economic contraction during the Phantom period. Yet this monetary decline appears to reverse suddenly around 1000 AD with the appearance of new silver sources, improved minting techniques, and expanded commercial networks that show no gradual development during the preceding centuries. Population data, where available, shows the same pattern of stagnation followed by sudden growth. Paleontological evidence, cemetery studies, and settlement archaeology all suggest that European population remained essentially stable throughout the silent centuries before beginning rapid expansion during the 11th century. This demographic pattern contradicts the agricultural innovations and territorial expansions that supposedly characterized Carolingian rule, suggesting that the political achievements attributed to this period may have been fictional. Technological innovation shows the most dramatic evidence of chronological compression. Watermills, windmills, improved metallurgy, and sophisticated mechanical devices all appear to emerge simultaneously around 1000 AD, without evidence of gradual development. The mechanical knowledge required for these innovations suggests access to classical Roman technical treatises and engineering principles that supposedly had been lost during the Dark Ages, but suddenly became available again during the High Medieval period. The cultural implications of 3 centuries of stagnation, followed by sudden Renaissance, strain credibility beyond the breaking point. Human societies, even during periods of political chaos and economic decline, continue to innovate, adapt, and evolve. The idea that European civilization essentially paused for 300 years, while maintaining sufficient institutional continuity to resume rapid development exactly where it left off, suggests artificial rather than organic historical development. The silent centuries make sense only if they never existed at all, representing instead a fictional buffer period created to separate genuine historical eras that actually occurred in much closer temporal proximity. Part 7. The Forgeries of Faith. The medieval church's relationship with historical documentation presents some of the most damning evidence for systematic chronological manipulation. Throughout the supposed phantom period, religious institutions produced an unprecedented number of documents that were later revealed to be forgeries, suggesting not merely isolated incidents of deception, but coordinated efforts to create false historical foundations for ecclesiastical authority. The donation of Constantine stands as perhaps the most audacious example of medieval historical fabrication. This document, supposedly written by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, granted the Pope temporal authority over Western Europe and vast territorial holdings. For centuries, the donation served as the legal foundation for papal political power, justifying papal claims to sovereignty over secular rulers and territorial dominion over much of Italy. Renaissance humanist Lorenzo Valla definitively proved the document's fraudulent nature in 1440 through linguistic analysis, demonstrating that its Latin contained medieval terms and constructions unknown in Constantine's era. Yet the donation was merely the most famous among hundreds of forged documents that emerged during the phantom centuries. The false decretals, attributed to early popes and church councils, provided canonical justifications for medieval ecclesiastical practices and hierarchical structures. These documents, supposedly dating to the earliest centuries of Christian history, established precedents for papal supremacy, clerical celibacy, and church jurisdiction that served the political needs of 9th century ecclesiastical authorities. Modern scholarship has revealed that virtually all of these supposedly ancient documents were created during the Carolingian period, precisely the time Illig identifies as phantom. The proliferation of forged saints' lives during this period raises additional questions about systematic historical manipulation. Hundreds of hagiographic texts supposedly documenting the lives of early Christian martyrs and saints emerged from Carolingian scriptoriums, providing historical foundations for local cults, pilgrimage sites, and monastic foundations. These texts frequently contained anachronistic details, geographical impossibilities, and narrative elements borrowed from earlier sources, suggesting retrospective creation rather than contemporary documentation. Monastery foundation charters present similar problems. Thousands of documents supposedly establishing monastic houses during the phantom centuries show suspicious linguistic features, legal concepts, and paleographic characteristics that suggest later composition. Many of these charters claim foundations by Merovingian or early Carolingian rulers whose existence is itself questionable, creating circular chains of documentary evidence that support each other without independent verification. The emergence of elaborate relic cults during the phantom period coincides suspiciously with the production of documentary evidence supporting their authenticity. Dozens of texts describing the translation of saints' relics from Rome, Constantinople, or the Holy Land to European monasteries appear during the 8th and 9th centuries, often accompanied by forged papal bulls and episcopal confirmations. The economic value of these relics, which drew pilgrims and their donations to religious institutions, provided clear motivations for creating false historical documentation. Biblical manuscripts and commentaries attributed to the phantom centuries show similar patterns of suspicious origin. The famous Carolingian biblical revision, supposedly undertaken by Alcuin of York under Charlemagne's patronage, demonstrates textual scholarship capabilities that seem inconsistent with the supposed intellectual resources of 8th century Europe. The standardized text and sophisticated critical apparatus suggest access to manuscript traditions and scholarly methods that supposedly wouldn't be available for centuries. Canon law collections from the Phantom period reveal the same combination of sophisticated legal thinking and anachronistic elements that characterize other forged documents. The systematic organization of ecclesiastical law, the resolution of canonical conflicts, and the integration of Roman legal principles all suggest jurisprudential capabilities that exceed what the supposed educational and institutional resources of the time could have supported. Perhaps most tellingly, the geographical distribution of these forged documents corresponds precisely with the territories that would later claim political or religious authority based on Phantom period precedents. Monasteries throughout the former Carolingian Empire produced foundation charters, papal privileges, and imperial grants that established their claims to lands, exemptions, and jurisdictions. The coordination required for such widespread documentary forgery suggests centralized planning rather than isolated incidents of local deception. The technical sophistication of these forgeries also raises questions about the capabilities of their supposed creators. Many documents demonstrate advanced knowledge of paleography, diplomatic formulae, and legal conventions that would have required access to authentic early medieval documents for comparison and imitation. The precision of linguistic archaisms, the accuracy of bureaucratic procedures, and the consistency of stylistic elements across multiple forged documents suggest systematic study of genuine materials by skilled professionals rather than crude attempts at historical deception. The implications extend far beyond medieval religious history. If ecclesiastical institutions systematically created false, documentary foundations for their authority during the Phantom centuries, it suggests that the Church was not merely a passive recipient of historical tradition, but an active creator of fictitious historical narratives. The scale and sophistication of these forgeries imply institutional coordination on an unprecedented level, raising the possibility that entire networks of religious houses participated in creating false histories to support shared political and economic objectives. Most disturbing of all, the success of these forgeries in deceiving scholars for centuries demonstrates the vulnerability of historical knowledge to systematic manipulation. If medieval forgers could create convincing historical documentation that remained undetected for hundreds of years, it raises profound questions about the reliability of all documentary evidence and the methods historians use to distinguish authentic sources from sophisticated fabrications. Part 8. Counter-theories and academic denials. The academic response to the phantom time hypothesis has been swift, comprehensive, and often dismissive, with mainstream historians marshalling extensive evidence to refute Eleg's claims. Yet the very vehemence of this reaction, combined with the methods used to defend conventional chronology, raises its own questions about the objectivity of historical scholarship and the possibility that institutional biases might prevent serious consideration of revolutionary theories. Archaeological evidence forms the primary foundation of academic counterarguments. Excavations throughout Europe have uncovered thousands of artifacts, building foundations, and burial sites that appear to date to the Phantom centuries through stratigraphic analysis and associated material culture. Coins bearing the names of supposedly fictional Carolingian rulers have been found in archaeological contexts that seem to confirm their circulation during the 8th and 9th centuries. Building foundations attributed to Phantom period construction show clear stratigraphic relationships with earlier and later structures that appear to support conventional dating. Yet Illig and his supporters argue that archaeological dating relies heavily on the very historical chronology that the Phantom time hypothesis questions. Stratigraphic dating assumes that artifacts found in the same archaeological layers are contemporary, but this assumption breaks down if the historical framework used to interpret those layers is itself flawed. If Carolingian artifacts were actually produced during the 11th or 12th centuries, but deliberately buried in contexts designed to suggest earlier dates, conventional archaeological methods would be unable to detect the deception. Carbon dating represents the most frequently cited scientific evidence against Phantom time. Hundreds of organic samples from supposedly Phantom period contexts have been subjected to radiocarbon analysis, producing dates that appear to confirm conventional chronology. Wood samples from Carolingian buildings, organic materials from burial sites, and agricultural remains from settlement excavations all seem to support the existence of the disputed centuries. However, radiocarbon dating faces several methodological challenges that Phantom time advocates argue compromise its reliability. The calibration curves used to convert raw radiocarbon measurements to calendar dates are themselves based on tree ring sequences and other natural records that assume conventional historical chronology is correct. If that chronology has been manipulated, then carbon dating calibrations might actually perpetuate rather than correct chronological errors. Additionally, the margin of error in radiocarbon dating for medieval periods often spans several centuries, making it difficult to distinguish between genuine 8th century artifacts and sophisticated 11th century forgeries. Documentary evidence presents another pillar of academic opposition to Phantom time. Thousands of medieval manuscripts, charters, chronicles, and administrative records appear to document events, people, and institutions during the disputed centuries. Byzantine, Islamic, and Chinese sources seem to corroborate European chronology through references to contemporary rulers and events. The sheer volume of documentary evidence appears to make systematic forgery impossible. Yet Phantom time advocates point to the demonstrable prevalence of medieval forgery and the systematic creation of false historical documents during precisely the period in question. If ecclesiastical and secular authorities could produce convincing forgeries of early Christian documents, papal bulls, and imperial charters, they possessed the technical capabilities and institutional motivation to create false chronicles and administrative records. The coordination required for such deception, while unprecedented, might not have been impossible given the political and religious incentives for chronological manipulation. Linguistic evidence represents another area of academic resistance. The evolution of Latin, vernacular languages, and linguistic borrowing patterns seems to require the full 3 centuries of development that Phantom time theory eliminates. Place names, personal names, and linguistic changes all appear to follow evolutionary patterns that support conventional chronology. However, linguistic evolution can be artificially accelerated during periods of intensive cultural contact and political upheaval. The compression of linguistic changes into shorter timeframes wouldn't necessarily invalidate phantom time. Theory: if the political and social transformations conventionally spread across 3 centuries actually occurred in rapid succession. Additionally, if learned scribes deliberately archaized their Latin to match supposed historical periods, linguistic evidence might reflect conscious artifice rather than natural evolution. The most troubling aspect of academic opposition to phantom time may be its tone and methodology. Rather than engaging seriously with Illig's evidence and arguments, many historians have dismissed the theory through ridicule, appeals to authority, and circular reasoning that assumes conventional chronology in order to disprove alternatives. This defensive reaction suggests that phantom time theory threatens fundamental assumptions of medieval scholarship in ways that scholars find difficult to address through normal academic discourse. International coordination among historians also raises questions about institutional bias. The rapid consensus against phantom time across multiple national academic traditions, despite significant differences in scholarly methodologies and political contexts, suggests either overwhelming evidence for conventional chronology or unprecedented coordination to suppress alternative theories. Given the political implications of chronological manipulation and the institutional investments in conventional medieval narratives, the possibility of systematic bias cannot be entirely dismissed. Perhaps most significantly, the academic response has failed to address phantom time's strongest arguments, while focusing on its weakest ones. Rather than explaining the cultural stagnation of the silent centuries, the mathematical problems of calendar reform, or the architectural anomalies of Carolingian construction, MAINSTREAM, historians have concentrated on archaeological and documentary evidence that phantom time advocates argue is compromised by the very chronological manipulation they seek to expose. Part 9. The other phantom timeline. The phantom time hypothesis isn't an isolated theory confined to one eccentric German researcher. Around the world, scholars working independently have identified similar chronological anomalies in their own historical traditions, suggesting that systematic manipulation of historical timelines might be a global phenomenon rather than a uniquely European occurrence. Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko has developed the most comprehensive alternative to conventional chronology through his new chronology project. Unlike Illig's focused claims about medieval Europe, Fomenko argues that virtually all of ancient and medieval history has been artificially extended through systematic duplication of historical periods, fictional characters, and invented dynasties. According to Fomenko's analysis, genuine human history begins only around 1000 AD, with everything earlier representing either complete fabrication or duplicated copies of later medieval events. Fomenko's methodology relies heavily on statistical analysis of historical texts, astronomical data, and mathematical patterns in chronological records. Using computer modeling and statistical techniques, he claims to have identified recurring patterns in historical narratives that suggest systematic copying and backdating of medieval events to create false ancient histories. His analysis suggests that figures like Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, and various Byzantine emperors are actually multiple versions of the same historical personalities, artificially separated in time to create the illusion of extended historical continuity. The astronomical evidence that Fomenko marshals appears particularly compelling. Ancient astronomical records from various civilizations, when subjected to modern mathematical analysis, frequently fail to correspond with the celestial phenomena that should have been visible at their supposed historical dates. Solar eclipses, lunar cycles, and planetary alignments described in ancient texts often match medieval astronomical conditions better than they match the dates traditionally assigned to those texts. This pattern appears across multiple civilizations and historical traditions, suggesting either systematic error in conventional chronology or coordinated manipulation of astronomical records. Fomenko's analysis of medieval maps and geographical knowledge presents additional anomalies that support chronological revision. Medieval cartographers demonstrated knowledge of geographical features, trade routes, and political boundaries that supposedly wouldn't be discovered or established for centuries. The precision of medieval maps depicting distant lands, the accuracy of geographical coordinates, and the detailed knowledge of global weather patterns all suggest access to information that conventional chronology claims was unavailable during the supposed Dark Ages. In China, independent researchers have identified similar chronological problems in traditional dynastic histories. The systematic nature of Chinese historical record-keeping, maintained continuously for over 2 millennia, should provide independent verification of global chronological accuracy. Yet, when Chinese astronomical records are correlated with European historical events, significant discrepancies emerge that suggest either systematic errors in Chinese historiography or manipulation of European chronology to match Asian historical frameworks. Islamic chronological traditions present their own anomalies that parallel European phantom time problems. The rapid expansion of Islamic civilization during the 7th and 8th centuries, covering vast territories from Spain to Central Asia within a few generations, required logistical and administrative capabilities that seem inconsistent with the supposed technological and organizational limitations of the period. The sophisticated legal systems, architectural achievements, and intellectual traditions that supposedly emerged, fully formed during early Islamic expansion, show similarities to the sudden cultural developments that characterize phantom time anomalies in European history. Egyptian chronology, despite thousands of years of archaeological investigation, continues to present dating controversies that mainstream Egyptology struggles to resolve. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from supposedly ancient Egyptian sites frequently produces dates that are centuries or millennia younger than conventional historical dating suggests. While archaeologists typically explain these discrepancies through contamination or calibration errors, the systematic nature of the dating problems raises questions about whether Egyptian chronology itself might have been artificially extended. The coordination required for global chronological manipulation would have demanded unprecedented international cooperation among medieval scholars, rulers, and religious authorities. Yet the political and religious motivations for such coordination existed during the medieval period, when competing civilizations sought to establish their legitimacy through claims to ancient origins and divine sanction. The Byzantine Empire, Islamic caliphates, and emerging European kingdoms all benefited from historical narratives that connected their contemporary authority to ancient traditions and prophetic fulfillments. Modern academic resistance to alternative chronologies shows remarkably similar patterns across different national and cultural traditions. Whether dealing with Fomenko's new chronology in Russia, phantom time theories in Germany, or chronological revisionism in other countries, mainstream historians respond with dismissive rhetoric, appeals to established authority, and methodological arguments that assume the validity of conventional chronology. This uniformity of academic response across diverse scholarly traditions suggests either overwhelming evidence for conventional dating or systematic institutional bias against chronological revision. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the multiple independent discoveries of chronological anomalies by researchers working in different countries, using different methodologies, and examining different historical traditions suggest that chronological manipulation might be a fundamental characteristic of historical knowledge rather than an isolated occurrence in medieval Europe. If true, this would mean that our entire understanding of human historical development, cultural evolution, and civilizational progress has been built on foundations of systematic deception that have remained undetected for centuries. Part 10. What year is it really? After examining the evidence from multiple perspectives, we return to the central question that launched this investigation. What year is it really? The phantom time hypothesis demands that we confront the possibility that our most fundamental assumptions about historical chronology might be wrong, that the year we call 2025 might actually be 1728, and that 3 centuries of human history exist only in fabricated documents and false memories passed down through generations of deceived scholars. The evidence for phantom time, while circumstantial, forms a disturbing pattern of anomalies that conventional historians have struggled to explain satisfactorily. The mathematical problems with calendar reform suggest that fewer years elapsed between ancient reference points and medieval corrections than official chronology claims. The cultural stagnation of the silent centuries contradicts everything we know about human social development and technological innovation. The architectural achievements attributed to phantom period construction demonstrate capabilities that seem impossible for their supposed historical context. Perhaps most compelling of all, the systematic nature of medieval forgery during precisely the period in question suggests that creating false prohistorical documentation was not only possible, but actively practiced by the very institutions responsible for preserving historical knowledge. If ecclesiastical and secular authorities could produce convincing forgeries of papal bulls, imperial charters, and saints' lives, they possessed both the technical capabilities and institutional motivation to create false chronicles, administrative records, and entire historical narratives. Yet the obstacles to accepting phantom time theory remain formidable. The coordination required for systematic chronological manipulation across multiple civilizations, languages, and political systems would have demanded unprecedented cooperation among medieval authorities. Archaeological evidence continues to support conventional dating, though phantom time advocates argue that archaeological interpretation relies on the very chronological frameworks being questioned. The sheer volume of documentary evidence from the disputed period appears to make wholesale forgery impossible, though the demonstrated prevalence of medieval forgery suggests that volume alone cannot guarantee authenticity. The psychological implications of phantom time theory may be its most troubling aspect. If 3 centuries of history were successfully fabricated and inserted into human chronology, it would represent the most audacious and successful conspiracy in human history. The intellectual and emotional investment that modern civilization has made in understanding its medieval past would be revealed as fundamentally misplaced. Universities have built entire academic departments around studying periods that might never have existed. Museums display artifacts from phantom centuries. Millions of students have learned false histories that shaped their understanding of human cultural development. More fundamentally still, phantom time theory calls into question the reliability of all historical knowledge and the methods we use to distinguish truth from falsehood in studying the past. If sophisticated forgeries could deceive scholars for over 1,000 years, how can we trust any historical source? If institutional authorities could systematically manipulate chronology for political purposes, how can we be certain that other aspects of historical knowledge haven't been similarly corrupted? The cultural impact of phantom time theory extends beyond academic history to popular understanding of medieval civilization and Christian development. The romantic image of Charlemagne's empire, the intellectual achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance, and the spiritual significance of millennial Christianity would all be revealed as elaborate fictions created to serve the political needs of later medieval rulers. The foundation myths of European civilization would crumble, leaving a much shorter and more compressed timeline of genuine historical development. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing possibility raised by phantom time theory is not that it might be true, but that we might never be able to prove it definitively. The evidence that would conclusively demonstrate systematic, chronological manipulation would be precisely the evidence that successful conspirators would have been most careful to eliminate or falsify. Carbon dating relies on calibration curves based on conventional chronology. Archaeological interpretation assumes historical frameworks that phantom time theory questions. Documentary evidence might itself be compromised by the very forgeries the theory attempts to expose. If phantom time theory is correct, it suggests that historical truth might be fundamentally unknowable, that human societies are more vulnerable to systematic deception than we had imagined, and that the guardians of institutional knowledge cannot be trusted to preserve accurate information about the past. The implications reach far beyond medieval studies to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of truth, the reliability of authority, and the possibility that everything we think we know about human history might be wrong. The real horror of phantom time theory isn't the possibility that someone successfully manipulated 3 centuries of history. The real horror is the possibility that they got away with it completely, that the deception was so thorough and so successful that we continue to live within its consequences more than 1,000 years later, unconsciously perpetuating lies that were created to serve the political ambitions of medieval rulers we may never be able to identify. If phantom time theory is true, then human civilization has been living in a temporal prison built from false memories and fabricated documents, and we may lack the tools necessary to break free from our chronological chains. Whether we are living in 2025 or 1728, whether Charlemagne existed or was a phantom conjured by ambitious conspirators, whether 3 centuries of human history are real or fictional, the questions raised by the phantom time hypothesis will continue to haunt anyone willing to examine the foundations of historical knowledge. In the space between truth and time itself, we are left with the unsettling possibility that our past is not what we think it is, our present is not when we think it is, and our future is built on foundations that may never have existed at all. Thanks for watching No Sleep Historian. Like and subscribe for more buried truths, lost chapters, and forbidden stories. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.